welcome to this Friday's edition of the India Development Debate. I'm Nayantara Rai in New Delhi. It's a Valentine's Day, a day where you celebrate love, but there's love lost between the Supreme Court, the Department of Telecommunications and the telecom companies. In a fiery hearing, the Supreme Court pulled up the government, pulled up the telecom companies and initiated contempt proceedings, asking that should the Supreme Court be wound up because its order has not been fulfilled. We are, of course, talking about the controversial case when it comes to the adjusted gross revenues. Adjusted gross revenues, the telecom companies like Bharti Airtel, Vodafone Idea, the erstwhile Tata Tele all have to pay more than 90,000 crore rupees to the central exchequer. You're talking about non-telecom PSUs like GAIL, Power Grid also being adversely impacted and to pay in lakhs of crores of rupees. The Supreme Court was unhappy. In fact, that's putting it very conservatively. Through the next 60 minutes, this is the big story we will be discussing. We've already heard the top brass of Vodafone PLC. That means globally, the global chief talking about how the Indian arm could become a going concern. Is it an eventuality of Vodafone Idea heading to bankruptcy court? Bharti Airtel recently went in for a fundraising. We're still talking about a large figure of over 30,000 crore rupees, but should it be using the money to expand for the upcoming 5G auction or to be paying for adjusted gross revenues? Will the Narendra Modi government finally intervene? Will the Modi cabinet dial in with a package? Remember, this is a civil case. It's a contract between the telecom companies and the government. Will it waive off the penalty, the interest on the penalty? All of that and a lot more we're going to be discussing on the India Development Debate. We're, of course, going to be getting you top experts right here. But before we do that, let's get to the big names that we've had through the day right here on ET Now, talking about this verdict and this crucial hearing.
So I think now they have to talk to the government, and if it is an order from the Honorable Supreme Court of India, they have to comply with it.
So, but your exposure to telcos is huge, sir, about 42,000 crore. Yes, sir.
39,000 crore funded exposure.
But how are you prepared to handle this if the telcos do actually
talk to them what are their plans, and I'm sure they would be having plans around this. This is not something that they might have expected it also. So now after this order, we will talk to them what are their plans to comply with the order, and whatever is the situation, we are capable of handling
How
it.
much you have already provisioned for this?
We have provided only for the NPAs, where we had NPA of about 9,000 crore, it is fully provided for. And there is recovery expected there. On the standard assets, we did not feel the need to provide at that stage. It is now for the telecom companies to decide how will they find the money or what course of action they will take.
are you prepared for the worst scenario?
We are prepared.
So just
All the strength to bear all the loss.
This is an issue which has been deliberated by the highest court of the land. They have given the judgment. With regard to the prospective part, it is again for the government, not for the regulator, to really make out that policy. TRAI in the past has given recommendations on this issue. If the government asks for further kind of recommendations in case they want us to deliberate on this issue, we will consult the stakeholders and give the recommendations again. But as of now, I really have not much role to play in that.
So I do think it is a bit too harsh, in particular hauling up a small-time babu in the telecom department seems to be overreach, because I think ultimately the government has taken a call. We all know in the budget they've not recognized as revenues of the government. So I mean, there's a larger question to be answered before they kind of go hammer and tong and collect money, not just from these private sector people, but also from we have entities like the Delhi Metro, which will get impacted. We'll have entities like National Stock Exchange will have to pay a share of the entire revenue, even though a very small portion of their revenue from telecom. The whole impact is going to be quite large.
Well, there you go. We're getting important stakeholders there. Rajneesh Kumar, of course, the top boss of India's largest bank. The big question is, can we see a domino effect? Is that what is going to take place? You already have a situation with the economy in the midst of a slowdown, credit offtake being hurt. And if you have now large NPAs, what's going to happen next. Is this going to be the end of the road as far as Vodafone Idea goes? Remember, Vodafone's had a disastrous run in India. You have the retrospective tax issue. Now you have the AGR case. Will the government change the definition of AGR at least prospectively? Is it fair for a telecom company to be sharing its revenues or what it earns from non-licensed be it real estate, be it other businesses? That and a lot more I'm going to be discussing now with Mr. R. Chandrashekhar. He's the former telecom secretary, as well as Prashant Singhal from EY, who understands telecom really, really well, one of the best experts that we have in the country. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on this edition of the India Development Debate. Mr. Chandrashekhar, please wear your cap as the former telecom secretary and help us understand what's going on. You have a government that talks about digital India. You have a government that talks about invest in India. And you've got a government that at the same time wants to not protect the telecom companies. The fact is, your telecom minister and your law minister is one, Ravi Shankar Prasad. Should they have actually appealed against this verdict? We can go into all of that at a later time. But what is the government thinking at the moment?
Let me start with a caveat. I don't speak on behalf of the government, and I have no idea what the government is thinking. But I can certainly, share my thoughts in terms of where this leads the sector to and what the possible options are. As far as this case itself is concerned, it has been going on, as everybody knows, for almost 15 to 17 years. And the telecom companies had received favorable opinions both from the TRAI and from the TDSAT. And this case before the Supreme Court was actually initiated on account of a government appeal against the TDSAT order. So therefore, the question of government filing an appeal against this Supreme Court judgment simply doesn't arise, because in the first place, it was they who had taken the matter to the Supreme Court. The second thing is that, the conditions and the environment in which the original interpretation of AGR was made by the DOT 17 years ago was completely different from the environment today in which the judgment has been passed. At that time, the contention was that let's keep this percentage of AGR and the definition of AGR simple, so that you don't get into a very complicated process like income tax, where you have exemption for this and exemption for that and all kinds of exemptions, so that ultimately it's only the chartered accountants who understand what exactly is going on. So he said, let's keep it simple, let's keep AGR as all the revenues that you've got. Perhaps at that time, situations like what we are now seeing, where there are companies for whom telecom is a small sliver of their whole portfolio of businesses, was not envisaged. The second thing is that the total amount over the years which was not paid has also accumulated. And in the meantime, the sector has been buffeted by a series of events which today have put some of the telcos at least into a difficult financial position. Apart from that, we've seen a lot of consolidation that has taken place in the last few years.
That's exactly what I said in my introduction. That's exactly what I said in my introduction, that look at GAIL, look at Power Grid, look at all of this. The fact is that you have a contract. Like you said, the situation has changed. Was there need for this litigation to have carried on for all the time that it did? Now you're looking at a situation where will we see the one operator actually heading to NCLT, which I'm of course talking about Vodafone Idea. Prashant Singhal, if you can come in. By fighting this case tooth and nail, not intervening, at one end coming out with relaxations when it comes to spectrum payments and talking about how they will not let a sunrise sector like telecom die, and the cabinet discussing ways to have a SOS package. At the same time, the very same government is fighting this case tooth and nail, giving out large exorbitant figures before the Supreme Court, and then saying there will be a self-assessment. The big question I'm going to ask is that, if I was in the telecom business, I'll be like, what's going on? What are these various wings of the government doing?
Yeah, so I think Nayantara, it is from a sector standpoint, I think there has to be some way that the government needs to intervene. I'm sure they're trying to do their best in order to resolve this situation. But it is a fairly grave situation. It is not just about the telcos or one of the telcos or two of the telcos. It is also about the domino effect that it could have in the value chain of telecom companies. Also remember that the telecom companies also have a spectrum payment which has to be made. So which is the 2-year moratorium as you talked about, which they just got from the Committee of Secretaries. Now, if any of the companies further go into IBC or liquidation, then we have another 90,000 crores or 80,000 crores or 1 lakh crores, which the government would stand to lose over the next 7 to 8 years, which would come to them. The direct and indirect employment. So I think it is a fairly grave situation. I think if you just compare India and India as a market, I mean, we have a fairly large number of subscriber base. I mean, we are staring at 900 to a billion subscriber numbers, right? And this is the second largest in the world today, or second or third largest in the world today. Do we really, with 2 operators or 2+1, where if you look at China, if you look at the US, they all have 3 or 4 operators which are having some kind of a double-digit market share. I mean, are we really ready for a 2-operator market? So I think even from a consumer standpoint, it makes more sense to have more choice. So I would think that it is, the situation is grave. There needs to be intervention from the government. Obviously, the Honorable Supreme Court has given an order which has to be complied with in some form or the other. But a relief package should be built in order to provide time to a distressed industry, in order to make the payments, or in order to see if there could be some reliefs which have been given. And typically, this is a Supreme Court order. Obviously,
and in fact,
the judges have applied
about that, Prashant, like I said, this is the same government, which on one end is talking about a relief package. It was very recently it came out with that, the deferred payments as far as spectrum goes. It forced the telecom operators. Obviously, a danda had been involved to make sure that they start increasing their tariffs. So, one would imagine that they are monitoring the situation, right? So, Mr. Chandrashekhar, lean in over here. What can be a way out for the government? A face-saving way for it to intervene. It has fought this case tooth and nail. I don't imagine it can go back to the Supreme Court and say we made this, and embarrass itself, and perhaps it doesn't want to perhaps embarrass itself and say we made this large mistake or whatever it is. So the question I want to ask you now is that what would be a face-saving measure that the government can actually do in the larger interest of the sector, in the larger interest of having investments, in the larger interest of one day having 5G sooner than later, and of course prices and all of that. What is it that can it do? Should it just, for example, waive off the penalty, waive off the interest and penalty, or it has the ability, for example, to maybe stretch out the timeline of payments?
Well, it is certainly an extremely difficult situation for the government, both in terms of substance as well as in terms of perception. First and foremost, I think the actual amount was, if I'm not mistaken, around the order of 25,000 crore, and the rest of it is accounted for by interest and penalty and interest on penalties and so on. So, but the way the Supreme Court order is worded and the tone and tenor of both the order and the observations, I think completely eliminate the room for government to make any kind of moderation of the effect of this order, both in terms of the quantum, by excluding, for example, penalties or interest on penalties, or on the time frame, because both of these have been cast in stone by the Supreme Court itself. And after the scathing observations by the Supreme Court, I think the government would be extremely wary about venturing into this territory once again. So if at all there are any options before the government, the options lie outside of this particular ruling on this particular issue, namely the interpretation of AGR. That's the reason why, when the earlier decision taken by the government to defer the payment for spectrum, it was taken conscious of the fact that that is a completely independent issue which still lies very much within the province of the executive. Now the questions or the suggestions that have been floating around are, okay, since you can't do anything about this, maybe the government should look at, the license fee, the percentage license fee going forward, or the percentage of spectrum usage charges, or some other such charges which have to be paid in the future. The problem with that is that, when you are trying to deal with a legacy issue of the past, like the AGR issue, with an action which impacts the future, then there is a complete misalignment between who benefits and who has lost, or on whom the burden of the past falls. And therefore, especially in the light of the Supreme Court's observation that, we are surprised at this action and it shows money power, etc., etc., that would certainly make the government wary of providing a misaligned, benefit to compensate for the kind of burden that has fallen on the telcos. So I'm afraid that the options are limited. But I want to draw your attention, Nayantara, to one particular line in the National Digital Communications Policy, which says that the government will prioritize universal coverage over revenue maximization. Now, universal coverage requires two things. One is a spread of infrastructure which requires investment, and the second is a low cost of access which enables more people to actually use these services, which has brought the telecom to this stage. Both will be impacted by this judgment because getting money for investment will be difficult. Even the money raised by Bharti, a lot of it will go into payment of these dues. And rates have already been raised by 30% towards the end of last year, and a further raise is not ruled out. And so the common man will be paying, 1 billion people, 1 billion subscribers will be paying this cost.
I take your point. And now I'm going to go back to Prashant Singhal. Prashant Singhal, that's exactly the point that Mr. Chandrashekhar was also saying. The options are limited. The situation has obviously gotten out of hand. You've got a Supreme Court which is now very, very upset, has asked the managing directors of all these companies to be present on March 16th if they do not make the payments. Bharti Airtel has said, we will pay 10,000 crore rupees before February the 20th. Now, having said that, Prashant, you understand these telecom companies so well. Help our viewers understand it. You're a Bharti Airtel that recently went in for a fundraise. So it can perhaps try and tide over the situation, but that also means that with that on the balance sheet, it could have deployed the funds for 5G, improving its network. We all know about call drops, right? You've got Rel Jio, which has to pay literally a pittance and has done so when it comes to AGR. Are you again going to see a completely distorted situation and yet another disruption in the telecom space? Is that now a given after today's hearing?
Yeah, disruption in the telecom space, I don't think the industry has any more room for further disruption. We already, you talked about, Bharti raising $3 billion. There is debt on all the balance sheets, which is there. There is the tariffs, even though with a 30% hike, India is still the lowest tariff market. If you look at the margins which are being made by the telecom companies in India versus what is there globally, even if you look at the EBITDA margins, I think we are one of the lowest. If you look at the ROI, return on investment, which has been there to the telecom companies, including all the three, right? Their margins are ROI is virtually zero or pittance from when you talk about the return to investors. So and then 5G is staring at us, and at this stage what we require is attraction in the market for people to come and make an investment. As against that, we have stressed companies which are sitting in where the investments are difficult to get. I would think that the room for disruption in this market is very limited. I think we are very disrupted, if not fairly disrupted. I think what we need is reconstruction in this market. I think it needs to be reconstructed. I think it needs to get back on track. And I'm sure, there is, and the government would be looking at all the legal views and legal experts right now to try and see how they can get the situation reconstructed
Right,
and
I
revived.
take your point.
Because
And
that's
in fact-
most important. By paying, three.
In fact, that's the point I want to take over to HP Ranina now. HP Ranina, it's very important to remember as well that this is a civil case. What the Supreme Court has done while castigating the companies and the government is upset about its order not being upheld and being followed through. It is still a civil case, right? So the question I want to put forward to you, Mr. Ranina, is, and I had asked Mr. Chandrashekhar, the former DOT Secchi, this is, can the government actually change the 4 boxes of that contract to try and provide a way out? But the fear then is, with this ruling, can the government do that without fearing a CBI inquiry, an ED inquiry, and all of that, which leads to policy paralysis?
See, my view is that government can bring in legislation immediately because Parliament is in session. Maybe they can do it next week, by the end of next week itself. So if legislation is brought in and if Parliament gives a new mandate or gives a new framework for the telecom licensing fees, AGR and other issues, then generally Parliament is supreme under the Constitution. And the government can then go back to the Supreme Court before the 17th of March and say that Parliament has now amended the law, clarified the law, having regard to the economic issues involved, namely that the amount of loans which the banks have extended to the telecom companies, the unemployment prospects as a result of closure of few companies, and complete disruption for consumers of telecom services. If Parliament was to pass a legislation amending and maybe giving more time for payment, streamlining the procedures for payment, the time limit for payment, the time frame for payment, and on the basic issue of AGR, what actually means AGR now according to the Parliament, then the issue of that the court would take that into account and the question of contempt would not arise. But Parliament has to pass, not the executive. There's a difference.
Mr. Ranina,
between the
are you talking
executive and
about a
Parliament.
legislation? Are you talking about a legislation? Are you talking about legislation like we saw for Section 9 of the Income Tax Act, which was done to make sure that the government got its way with Vodafone Idea and paid that retro tax? Are you saying that it should be an amendment and a legislation like that to achieve a different goal, which is this time to actually save the telecom companies, not make them pay?
Yes, legislation alone can save it, not the government action, because government action would be castigated by the Supreme Court once again. You see, there's a difference between the judiciary, the executive,
Mr.
and
Ranina,
Parliament. If Parliament were to pass a legislation...
My next question to you.
Sorry?
My next question to you then, Mr. Ranina, is that let's see if the government actually does that, in Parliament, because so far we're still waiting to hear from the Telecom Minister, Ravi Shankar Prasad. We've still not seen any intervention of sorts, and let's not forget the Telecom Minister and the Law Minister is the same. So he had to have known what it is that his officers were going to be arguing in the Supreme Court. Mr. Ranina, I've heard of the Income Tax Department saying you owe us tax and they name a tax figure. Then the dispute becomes about the quantum of tax. I've never heard of any government being saying, you owe us money and now you do an assessment and tell us how much you owe us. And that's the next thing could that be the next dispute we'll see in the telecom case? They have gone to the Supreme Court with these large exorbitant numbers of what the telecom companies owe them and simultaneously asking the telecom companies to also do a self-assessment. Yeah. Today, Bharti Airtel says I'll pay 10,000 crore rupees before February 20th. Are these numbers in 90,000 odd crores actually going to be paid by the telecom companies, or will that be the next dispute where, the Airtels, Vodafones and all will say, hey, we don't owe you this much, we actually owe you this much, and the figures could be very different. Is that the next dispute?
No, that dispute, I think the Supreme Court has already clarified what is AGR. according to the present legislation. They have said the present legislation is very clear. The annual gross revenues are very clearly specified. The definition is clear. We stand by that. That's it. Now the question is, can Parliament change it? The answer is they have the power to change it, having regard to the general economic situation prevailing today, having regard to certain factors. Parliament can make the change, not the executive, not the government. So if legislation is done, for example, take the case of this Vishwas scheme. Government has now come up with a scheme which says that income tax, you will waive the interest and penalties if you pay the money by 31st of March under the new budget. So if they can waive the interest and penalties laid down by the law, the current Income Tax Act, then surely Parliament can also pass a legislation to say, well, this will be either the new definition of AGR or that interest and penalties are not involved or non-telecom fees income is not to be taken into account. All that could be done.
Correct. And in fact, we do understand from our sources, the Reserve Bank of India is in favor of a new definition of AGR. That is the advice also that it has given to the government. The bigger question, of course, is the government in listening mode and wants to dial in with an intervention package. With that, gentlemen, I'm out of time. So I'm going to thank Prashant, Mr. Chandrashekhar, as well as Mr. Ranina for joining us on this Friday's edition of the India Development Debate. And I suspect it's something we'll be discussing a lot more in the coming week as well. So here's an open invitation to keep coming back for this burning issue. With that, we'll take a short commercial break, but stay tuned. We've got a lot more lined up for you on the other side.